Edge of Chaos, starring Neurotoxin and Joe Ryan. Edge of Chaos is a free-flowing discussion, occasionally dealing with mature topics.
Alright everyone, welcome to the Edge of Chaos. I'm Neurotoxin, here again with Joe Ryan.
Yes.
Yeah, Joe, I have a great economic solution just to all our problems that we have with inequality and people not making enough money and labor problems and access to healthcare and everything. You know what it is?
I can't wait to hear this.
Yeah. We should outlaw the wheel.
Okay.
Think of all the jobs we'd create if we didn't have the wheel. It's like everyone would be dragging firewood back to their cave, so everyone would be equally employed.
Wow.
I mean, it'd be like a progressive paradise.
But then again, Egypt didn't have the wheel, and they were not equal.
Well, shit. So
they
maybe
built the pyramids. They just only had certain people hauling the blocks on their backs. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and one guy all decked out in gold sitting there looking at them, right?
They're going, "Oh, that looks heavy. Yeah, I'm not helping you with that. Have fun."
That sucks. Yeah, but hey, I'm a demigod, so that's okay, right?
Exactly.
No, but
that guy with the snake on it for a head tells me that I'm in charge. So.
yeah, how many mushrooms did you eat that day, sir? But I feel like though, but you're almost. I mean, you're more right about this than I am. Even that fail to make anyone equal. So why are we talking about restrictions on the free market as a solution to equality? I don't understand. I have a huge problem with inequality. I don't get how this is supposed to work. These minimum wage protests. I don't understand.
It is interesting to note how widespread this has become in a short time. I know I mentioned in the last show the prevalence, which 20 years ago, used to never see anyone protesting Wal-Mart. Now you see it happening all the time. And not only that, and now we see people from McDonald's, Burger King, all the fast food restaurants protesting. And I guess there was one interesting. I only hear about these recent fast food ones on the news. I actually have not yet seen in Southern California here one restaurant with protesters in front of it yet. But I guess in a lot of these other states, they're having protests at some fast food restaurants. And I mean, to be fair, there's tons of them, so it's hard to get people in front of every single one of them, I suppose.
That or they're just not all that well organized.
That too, but it is something that's around, and it's something that didn't used to be even a short time ago.
You know, I'm no fan of these corporations like McDonald's, and I'm no fan of them probably for different reasons than a lot of the liberals and a lot of the people protesting. One, it's basically they're poisoning the food supply. Because that shit barely deserves to be labeled.
And a lot of the demand for people who are against things like genetically modified wheat or, cows that are pumped full of hormones, it's places like that demand that shit because they want huge volume at a low price so they can then make a cheeseburger cost 99 cents. So,
essentially.
Yeah. Is that what we're talking about?
Right, and it's exactly what I'm talking about. The meat, it's not even meat. If you take actual chemical samples of it, it's basically corn that has so much corn growth hormone, in it that the cow can't properly digest it. It looks like meat, and it has the texture of meat, and you put enough crap in it, it'll taste like meat, but you're actually just eating corn. And then you can't properly digest it either, which is why Americans are fat. So this is a bad, raw deal all around. And we can go further and say, well, why is McDonald's or Burger King able to get away with this? Well, one of the answers is farm subsidies. These mega corporations that are the agricultural corporations like ConAgra and Monsanto, they eat up most of the farm subsidies. So then they're able to mass produce just this genetically engineered garbage, and they can outcompete the small farms. So I have that problem, and I mean, I've never worked in fast food. I guess I have.
So I worked at McDonald's for a week.
Oh, you did? Okay.
I lasted a week before I ran screaming away. And this is at a time in my life when I had no career. And I, like these people, was basically just working, wage an hour type of job. No benefits, no vacation time, no sick time. Either you worked, you showed up, you collect a check, or you don't. And you don't. So I guess part of my, and I wouldn't say support maybe is a strong word, because
Empathy,
I might question their
solidarity.
methods, but I understand where they're coming from in a very direct way because I worked in that world for many years, not many, but a few years of my life, over 5. So I get it. Like I get it because they don't get paid enough in a lot of ways. And
Well,
and I
what is
think
enough?
the argument, well, that question will never be answered because no one will agree. I guess what is being argued, and I posted on our page in response to something you wrote this week, the Jon Stewart bit that he did on this, um, where he was playing a lot of people that were saying things like, and mostly these were Fox News people, obviously, or Fox Business, which is the worst network ever on television. If you ever have a chance to actually watch that, it's like the opposite of CNBC, but it's just as brainless. And it's got the likes of Stuart Varney on it, and it's the only network that'll let Lou Dobbs have a TV show. Um, but
Okay.
Lou Dobbs never met a brown person he liked. Never. Anyway, um, he, they were saying things like, "Oh, well, okay, yeah, it's not enough. We'll just have to start paying these guys $100,000 an hour, I guess, right? What's enough? What's enough?" And I guess Jon Stewart's point was, "Okay, wait a minute. So maybe there's a middle ground between the $200 a week they get now and the $4 million a week you're saying they would end up
Okay.
with. Maybe there's just slightly, maybe just a little more. And I get your argument, and maybe that's where it always fails. But about the fact that the idea that it won't be past the customers, that it'll just eat into profits to these companies. You're right, that won't happen. That's a fairy tale. And anyone who actually believes that, you're right, is being disingenuous.
Right.
But I guess the other point I would make is it's been done in the past, and it hasn't proven as nearly as inflationary as has been claimed.
Well, that
That's
would
one thing I
depend
would say.
on. Well, here's the thing. Okay, first of all, to answer a couple of things, I mean, like I have worked in fast food, but it was for a small mom and pop pizza shop, which is very different from working for
Very.
McDonald's or Papa John's. And literally, and actually, I also worked. I worked for Papa John's, I believe it was, for about a week, or Domino's, and also last about the same, just about the
It was
same as about
Domino's. I
another
remember
week.
that.
And I left for the same reasons. They basically treat you the same way they treat that piece of meat.
Basically.
That's all it is. And the reason for that, and this is nobody wants to hear this, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that you're replaceable. You're
Oh,
expendable. When I
yeah.
used a term on edgeofchaospodcast.com, when I wrote the article about minimum wage hikes and how stupid these protests are for that reason, that this is unskilled labor. It's not unskilled because I think these people are useless or they don't actually have any skills. It's that they're literally competing with every average Joe Clueless that just got out of high school that has no marketable skills, no formal education, no vocational training. Well, I can flip burgers and clean a bathroom. There's millions of people that can do that. So it makes sense that they're paid so little because that's really to their employer all they're worth. And if we want to change that equation, we have to kind of change what they're worth to their employer. Setting a floor basically on what they're paid, which is what a minimum wage is, I don't see how that helps them because the amount of the value of the dollar is not fixed. The moment you raise the minimum wage, these corporations are just going to pass that on to their consumers. They're just going to raise their prices. We've witnessed this over and over and over again. Why would it be any different this time?
Well, I guess one question I would ask. I was reading your article about that, and I thought, couldn't they institute a tax? Let's just say we don't even talk about this at a federal level. Let's just say the state of California
Okay.
was very, very used to starting a law on its own and end up spreading it to other states.
Yeah.
We have a lot of laws about, let's say, workers' rights or we do a lot of things at our state level because the state is so big that the federal government doesn't do. So let's just say we decided to raise, because we've always had a higher minimum wage than the national for years.
True.
We've
True.
already,
Yes.
because they're talking about, oh well, it's only $5.75 an hour. That's the national minimum wage. Here ours has been at 8 for a couple of years now, I think.
Well, they're raising it to 10. Actually, I believe.
Right. Actually, yeah, I forgot about that. Jerry Brown passed that through the
Uh,
supermajority liberal state Congress that we've got here.
Insanity. But
$10
okay,
an hour minimum wage.
Go on.
What would it? I guess the question would be: what if they were to institute basically a higher tax rate on certain industries that disproportionately employ that sort of labor, that sort
Okay.
of pay bracket, let's say?
So you're talking about basically regulatory restraints It's still a regulatory restraint on how much a corporation can pay their employees. Now, there's European countries that have tried this. For example, in Switzerland, they just voted this down, but they were looking at it. I believe in France they have something like this, where corporations, like the lowest paid employee, can only make, say, has to make at least 1/15th of what the CEO makes, or something along.
Ooh, that's a good one too. Yeah,
Right. So a lot of liberals that I argue with, smart liberals that have actually gone to college, that are not just out there protesting, screaming, down with capitalism, they don't know what the fuck that word means. This is a suggestion that they have, is like profit caps, income, like pay ratio caps, stuff like that.
And this is something that our new guest writer Brian Custer has been in favor of, that we've talked about before, is idea of a guaranteed wage from the government, but also percentages. I've heard him talk about that before.
Right.
I've
Now,
heard that.
Right, this is a typical progressive approach. Now, it's not. I mean, it's definitely a smarter idea than just going out there with picket signs and screaming, because that accomplishes nothing, and it's not really very well thought through. Here's my concern with that. It's still, you can't just dodge the laws of economics. It's not how much money you make, it's the buying power of your money. So we have to look at the outcomes of this. Okay, let's say we establish this CEO to the lowest paid worker ratio, and you're saying, okay, you have to have so many in the industry. If you have, let's say, more than 30% of your workforce making minimum wage, let's say, then you have an extra tax, something along those lines. That's what you're suggesting. Right, Joe?
Or I guess the idea of, if they had that, then it's going to that income level in some kind of program on the other end would be the idea. That'd be the other way to get it out of the company without, because the argument against simply raising the wage is that they're just going to cut it out of the other customers who are in higher income brackets, right? So I guess the idea of the tax would be in lieu of minimum wage raise, wherein the revenues from that tax go purely to that targeted income group. That would at least nominally do the same thing in theory, let's say.
Okay. And, yeah, I understand what you're saying. And you would have like some sort of special social safety net that basically it requires them, if you have very low paid workers, as a corporation, you're required to participate, or as an employer, you're required to participate. And then it's supposed to go to benefit people in that low wage range. Something along those lines. Now, here's my concern with that. I understand what you're saying. It's, like I said, it's a much better idea than just picketing. I'll give you guys that. My concern with that is still, you're making the assumption that just like raising the minimum wage, everything else is going to stay the same. Everything else will remain constant. And this regulation will accomplish what it's intended to. I want to look at the actual consequences of this, and we have examples of what happens. There's multiple states, multiple countries in Europe that have tried this, and the results have been abysmal. So a couple of reasons. First of all, if we want to talk about, you're talking about a social welfare program that specifically earmarks the income, the tax money, for some sort of social service. I'd like to turn your attention to the state of public education here in California. Where we have every 5 to 10 years, we pass some sort of new tax, new bond, some sort of new revenue-making program, revenue-making legislation for money that's specifically earmarked for education. And just magically all that money ends up in the prison system. It's amazing how that works.
Well, to be fair, a lot of the bonds that pass aren't for education. They're for building things for
like
schools.
Prisons.
And, well, no, it ends up being like, because our schools, if anyone lives in, like, let's say, certain areas of California, they've seen, like, all the old schools have been totally ripped down and replaced with newer schools. It's been a little nuts. And a lot of the bonds were for that, because some of the schools were legitimately old. I know that our high school, while we were going there, was being redone slowly. And it's unrecognizable now compared to even a few years ago.
So I'm going to have to interrupt you here a second. Those are primarily local bonds. They're school district bonds. I'm talking about state level stuff.
There were lots of state ones that did the same thing. I've known more than
I believe you, but I know that I've talked to actually a couple of union organizers, people that are teachers union organizers, and they've been involved in education protests and trying to fight the cuts for years. And you'd be amazed at how much we agree on. Even though you would think as a libertarian, teachers' unions wouldn't like me. No, the guys in charge of the teachers' union wouldn't like me. The teachers actually doing the work, they're like, yeah, these unions are terrible. They're not doing anything for us. Because a huge part of the problem is that at the state level, that money that's earmarked for education doesn't ever end up going to the schools. It ends up basically in the prison system, to put it bluntly. And this is why I was such a strong opponent of Prop 30. It's just giving Jerry Brown more money to feed the prison unions. It's got to stop at some point. So where I'm trying to go with this is, even at the state level, which, I mean, California is a big state. It's the size of an average European democracy. You're assuming you can trust the government to put that money that you're taking from corporations like McDonald's or Wal-Mart toward whatever it's actually directed to, toward whatever it's actually intended to go to. I have absolutely zero faith that's going to happen.
No, I mean, you'd have to have some kind of, and I don't even know what you would have this be, but you have to have some kind of accountability mechanism. I don't know if it would be some kind of, I mean, not to suggest more committees necessarily, but didn't the nonpartisan redistricting thing, hasn't that started to sort of turn the tide of the gerrymandering that we've had in this state?
A little bit, but I would think it does better.
Would that help at all, or I don't know. We're purely theoretical ground right now, so I'm spitballing at the moment.
I think quantitatively speaking, quantitative comparison, I would say yes, the nonpartisan committee is probably better than direct legislative control. But better doesn't mean it works, doesn't make it good. That doesn't mean a committee like that would be better than just a free market economy. Not obviously for districting, but for something like this with social safety nets. I mean, look at Social Security. We've talked about this multiple times on the show, about how Social Security would have worked or might have worked, except you had past presidents and past Congresses and said, hey, look,
Reagan,
all of that. Actually, it was more Nixon that started this, interestingly enough, and each of them had a Democratic Congress. And they're like, "Ooh, look, lots of money.
Reagan really ramped it up. How did he pay for all the missile defense out of Social Security?" And that's the thing, that when they say it's going bankrupt, it isn't. But it is because they won't stop taking from its coffers. And because they have thus far, we spent what money we should have been like banking and accumulating instead of saving it up. We've spent it all. So now this huge, jump in people taking from the system is gonna, that's the problem.
Well, it's called lack of foresight. Right, but I mean,
there's other problems with it too, but that's one.
Well, the Social Security Fund owns about 20% of our national debt, last I checked.
Yes.
And that, everybody talks about how we can't afford to pay our debt and we keep making more debt. Well, that's what we're borrowing against. So that's a ticking time bomb, and it's like tick, 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 tick. You're just like waiting.
I was amazed to find out, and not to get too far off on this subject, I was amazed to find out that the maximum amount of income at which you are responsible for Social Security taxes is $105,000 a year. That is surprisingly low in light of how many, and that hasn't been adjusted, that rate, in like 50 years. Back then, that was a very rich person. Now it's like your average guy living in Orange County makes that much money. Obviously, it's not true of the nation, but when you think about how many people in this country do, how many millionaires do we have in this country, just offhand?
So you want to take more of their money for a benefit that they're never going to see themselves, because they're never.
That is the progressive way you spread the wealth.
That's that. We're talking. See, now we're talking about idealism.
The difference between me and Obama is I actually am outward about that.
Okay. Now let's go back to talking about fast food strikes, just because that's what this show's about. Now, here's the thing. So when you talk about these ideas, and I mean, honestly, I can bring in the Social Security thing just as well. There's zero reason to believe this will work the way it's intended. I mean, you can come up here, you can sit here and come up with these regulations and regulatory interventions, really, all day. And some of them do make more sense than others. Simply raising the minimum wage doesn't do shit. I think we agree on that. As far as some of these more kind of complex structural ideas, they may be a little bit more effective in a comparative sense. But again, look at Europe. What happens is basically when you start to effectively take rich people's money, like what you're suggesting, what they end up doing is they start finding ways around your regulation. And they're rich, and they're smart, and they're driven by keeping their money. There's no way the bureaucrats are going to keep up with them. It's a reality of human society. It's unpleasant to think about, and we don't want to think that rich people, or just really anyone that has money and has resources, they're out to save it first and give it to you to redistribute a distant second. But that's just how it is. That's just how people behave. I mean, there's people running from France, literally billionaires, moving their money to Russia, of all places. Because in Russia, you give Putin a big fat check for a few $1 million or euros, and you can do whatever the fuck you want with the rest of your money. Whereas in France, the government wants to legitimately take 50% of it. Who wins?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on the rich person. Where you have people like there was a big flap here last year that Phil Mickelson, who's a San Diego resident, actually was talking about all the tax hikes that Jerry Brown got passed,
Mm-hmm.
especially for the higher income brackets. He was talking about leaving the state because of it, and there was, oh
Mm-hmm.
well, what kind of? He ended up not. He ended
Okay.
up not. Makes me wonder, did he hire a new accountant or did he just have a come to Jesus moment? But what's interesting, I did read an article, and I'm surprised you didn't mention, about this state and how the tax hikes have actually, they did cause a fleeing of, like, when you look at the returns that came through after it's been put through, there were more revenues. That was actually more than they were expecting. And by and large, the income bracket, the average, people didn't flee. There weren't,
You know, I've
Hollywood's still Hollywood. In other words, we have a lot of celebrities, and they knew they could take more of their money and have them still stick around at least enough to get some more of their cash.
okay. Look,
And so the claim is, I think it was a Rolling Stone article. It was Jerry Brown's California Miracle. I think they called it, or something like that. I know it's a puff. It was a puff piece. I'll admit
it's Rolling Stone.
it was a puff piece. It was.
You remember that when that magazine was still good because it was about music? Yeah.
And I rolled my.
It's
I
a
rolled my.
gossip rag.
It's got good stuff in it. It had a good article
About
Snowden
music,
I just
yes.
read.
About politics, no.
It was a good article about Snowden and Greenwald, but anyhow, it's a different
Okay.
subject. But and it was like I said, it was a puff piece. It was blowing him basically, and he's done a lot of things that were not good. And they had one line to that, like the prison thing. One line got mentioned. Oh yeah, by the way, he overcrowds his prisons and just defying the Supreme Court and letting them go. Anyway, the argument is, look, everyone was predicting this doom and gloom, and he raised taxes, and he did balance the books, and now things are starting to turn around, and the state's improving,
Okay.
and
I
the budget's better, and the et cetera, et cetera.
Joe, I want to see the data on this. I want to see the numbers. If citing a Rolling Stone puff piece is not going to convince me, because I've seen, and we had similar policies get passed under Schwarzenegger before Brown. I mean, all these guys are exactly the same. The governors of this state, they change parties, they don't change policies. It's pathetic. And they're all centrist. They're not real liberals. They're not real conservatives.
The deficit has gone down, though, in the last few years.
Well, okay, I'd have to, like I said, I need to see the numbers, and especially the revenues, because I know we had these policies get passed under Schwarzenegger, and the revenues actually got shittier. Because you had, at least I've read articles that attributed it to money fleeing. Now, it's probably, the thing is, this gets wrapped up in politics. So you have progressives that'll cherry pick their data and cherry pick their evidence and blow the guy who did it. Oh, look, there's no drain. Now we have this statist miracle, and we don't. It's bullshit. But then, yeah, you have conservative media that's like, oh, look, we're back in the 19th century because all the money fled, and 5 more years of this and we'll be in North Korea. No, we won't.
I think that the argument of the money fleeing, it was in Schwarzenegger's term because back then going to Vegas and Phoenix was an attractive option. Now those markets are so depressed, and they still are. Make no mistake about it.
Oh, they are. Yeah.
And they still are. That's not a tenable, at least for the moment. So you could say that it's not all Jerry Brown's genius, like Rolling Stone makes it seem.
None of it
It's
is.
just that, well, we'd rather stay even still because it's still the best option as far as quality of life.
But
You
in
could
that
say that.
case,
If you're a rich motherfucker, you could say
you
that.
could say that. And again,
Phoenix isn't going to beat Malibu. You know what I mean? It's just not, especially
Sure.
now.
So this is the thing. I guess what we agree on, Joe, is the very important factor here is attribution. Yes, this is happening, but is it really happening because the money isn't fleeing? Why isn't it fleeing, and so forth? So if you're going to make this argument, okay, the money won't flee. Why? Well, because Vegas and Phoenix are doing so shitty that even if you raise taxes here in California, the money won't leave. Okay, maybe that's partially true. I don't have the numbers. I can't argue, but I can see that. But if you're going to basically extrapolate this and generalize this to policies that'll work in general in different economic times, when all the countries surrounding or the states surrounding aren't in the toilet economically, when there is a place for the money to move, that's not going to work. You can't just expect these conditions to be true everywhere. I mean, I hear what you're saying. There is some truth to it. Now, the other issue that we invariably have to deal with, and I touched on this with the money earmarked for education going to prisons, is corruption. I mean, I've seen a lot of progressives when I bring up Europe, and notice I haven't said, oh, look, we're going to end up in Greece or Italy, because we're not.
Yeah, I really hate that.
Right. I bring
You
up
have
Europe.
said it before, but you didn't this time.
Well, okay. But look, I was probably being facetious. I was probably
That's something
exaggerating.
Hannity says a lot, though it means it.
Well, here's the thing. We don't have to end up in Greece to be in a bad place. If we end up in Spain or in France or in the Netherlands, and those places you can reasonably compare us to, that wouldn't be cool either. It wouldn't be as bad as Greece or Italy. Now, the reason Greece or Italy are so bad is because corruption just reigns supreme in those countries. Whereas in France, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, there's actually a little more oversight, a little more accountability. Now, in the U.S., I would say that's on a state-by-state basis. You look at places like Detroit, and all of a sudden the Greek scenario really doesn't seem that far-fetched.
Yeah.
I mean, or there's places in the South.
There are, and we were talking about Camden, New Jersey, which is just like Detroit, and it literally like is a third world war zone. That, you know, and Detroit, yeah, you mentioned the last mayor is now serving 20 years in jail.
Not enough.
I mean, it's bad, and it's getting that way in more and more cities. It's the scary part.
Right, and there's places in the South. I mean, Louisiana. Okay, let's talk about New Orleans. You want to talk about corruption reigning supreme? I mean, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, so, the federal government declared the police force in New Orleans the number one threat to the citizenry of New Orleans.
Oh, wow.
The police are the number one most dangerous thing facing the residents of New Orleans.
Yeah, the Russian government would be proud. If New Orleans is
pulled over, it's better that it's some guy on the street than it is a cop.
Yeah, because if they're just going to mug you, they're not going to rape you and kill you.
They're not going to kill you, yeah. And then drop a gun next to your body and say you were going to him first.
But that's only, if you're white, you're fine. That's only if you're black.
Disproportionately, yes. That's true.
It's the South. So a lot of the corruption there, yes, it's economic corruption, but it's also along racial lines. But you have to keep this in mind if you're proposing these policies, that you're going to have governments that are predominantly of one ethnicity, that are extremely corrupt, and that when they abuse this, because corruption, the more power you give government with regulations, the more power the corrupt politicians are going to have. If you have that in a place like Louisiana, or like Georgia or Alabama, where, you know, the fundamentalism and the nationalism still reigns supreme, you're going to have not just corruption, you're going to have racist corruption. And this is a reality. So in places where there's a little more accountability, then you're just worried about inefficiency. But in places with less accountability with corruption, that's an additional factor. So I would agree that California probably wouldn't end up with an Italy or Greece scenario, but there are definitely places in this country that you could easily make that comparison.
Close up this topic. Here's an odd thought I just had in a question. Could this state, if it doesn't spur the country, because it traditionally, we raise our minimum wage and then a couple of years later the federal government does the same thing, but they're never the same, obviously, but we'll go up a buck, they'll go up a buck. It's kind of been the way it's been the last few 10, 15 years or so. Is it possible that when you go to other states it's still $5.75 at a point where we're already 10 an hour? Could the lower skilled workers here actually be crowded out by people like fleeing from other states that are still at the federal rate wanting to move here? And would that influx of that economic bracket cause like a downward pressure on things like rents and things like that? It makes you wonder about.
I doubt it. I doubt it.
About the country, because you were talking about. I mean, it's the same country, but it's different.
Here's the thing.
The
reason I doubt that is because even though the minimum wage in California is higher, if you look at how much shit costs here versus some of the places with lower minimum wages, making minimum wage, remember again what I said, it's not how much you make, it's what your money buys.
Yeah, we're actually more dollar for dollar than most other places. That's true.
Right. So I don't think a lot of low wage, low skill labor is going to move to California because, hey, look, the minimum wage is higher.
It's going to be new Okies and new Arkies.
I doubt it. I don't see that happening. Now,
it's an interesting thought, though.
Right. So my concern is these ideas of regulations, they work great in theory, but they presume that the corporations that you're trying to tax and regulate are going to behave exactly the same way. They're not going to respond to these laws, these regulations. I mean, a simple thing you could do in a fast food store, and actually I've seen a lot of memes about this, but I haven't seen any serious empiricism about it, is you could automate. And you could probably get rid of 30% of that workforce just by setting up little robots that take people's orders.
Which we've had those, I know I've seen them in Carl's Jr.'s and Jack in the Boxes. They have like a kiosk. And you go up to the kiosk and you go, okay, tap to begin. You go, okay, what do you want? And there's like burgers, chicken sandwiches, fries. You just tap it. My experience, though, those machines suck, which you could improve, obviously, and they're slower because just telling a person something, it's always faster than going tap. Okay, back to main. Okay, tap. Like if you want more than one thing, let's say, or if you want a special order, God help you. God
Oh,
help
yeah.
you.
Joe,
Okay,
Joe,
custom, remove lettuce, enter.
Joe, I agree that they suck,
I
but I
don't know
would
if that would ever fully
say
replace it because it's so
I
much
disagree.
worse.
Well, here's the thing. The laws of economics do apply. They suck because it's not worth it to invest in a good program or in a good system when your employee taking that order makes $7.50 an hour. Now, if you have to pay that employee $10 an hour, let's say, or if he costs you, let's say, $10 an hour because of taxes and extra social service programs you have to pay for or whatever, all of a sudden it becomes worth your while. Remember, well, these organizations, these corporations are all about volume. And a program that works and a system that works, you only need one, and then you just buy X amount of them for all the stores. So I would think that, automation is a big thing. And, I love to hear people complain
Okay.
about outsourcing of all the skilled labor jobs in this country, which happened in the late 70s for the most part, and
Well,
early
in the
80s.
'90s wouldn't have to happen.
Right. But a lot of the reason for that was because the unions got so powerful and so demanding that a lot of the corporations said, you know what, it's just not worth it to have human workers anymore. We're going to have children in Bangladesh build this shit. Now,
But
moral hazard notwithstanding, that's what happens. You can't regulate Bangladesh.
when you throw out morals, yeah, a lot of things are possible. I will say though
No,
that
no, no, no. But this is reality. How do you?
your
How do you
scenario though, my point
Yes.
being your scenario specifically with the fast food, you're never going to replace 3 human cashiers that can do 5 orders in 5 minutes with one kiosk that can do one order in 3 minutes. It's just
Perhaps.
not. It's going to slow things down, and that volume you talked about isn't going to be there anymore.
What I am saying, Joe,
Right now, the humans do it faster, so they
we
can still afford
don't
to.
know that that's going to stay that way if there's a demand for faster machines. What I'm saying is,
Right,
historically speaking,
right now.
looking at history, the late 20th century with unions, with economic regulations, every time a government has, in full faith, without corruption, without Soviet socialism, real Western Fabian socialism that's trying genuinely to help the poor and to help the low skilled workers. Every time they've tried to regulate, the rich people have not adapted, they've not conformed to it, they've successfully found a way around it. And it's drained the resources from where the regulations are. It's fucked over the middle class's desire to produce, and the poor people have stayed exactly where they were every time. I don't. How many more times do we have to try this before we're like, you know what, this doesn't work? Poverty is a real thing, inequality is a real thing, but maybe we need a different strategy. And what I want to close out on, the kind of the same thing I closed out my article on. If you read Thomas More or Daniel Webster, who came long before the Fabian Society, the original socialists that wrote kind of they're the socialist equivalents of Karl Marx. A lot of their work was based on the idea that socialism has to be global, because then there's nowhere for the money to run to. No, motherfucker, you're gonna hand over your money because there's nowhere for you to go.
Well, there's a lot of
But
socialist countries out there.
yes, and that's not where rich guys put their money. They put it in Russia. That's why they
Of course,
put it
there's
in
a lot
Russia.
of lawless wastelands too.
Russia is not a lawless wasteland. It's a nice corporate
Well, I
oligarchy
didn't
where
mean them.
rich person. But that's where they're going. They're not going to Central Africa, right, Joe?
Well, you could say Russia's lawless in some regards, but yeah.
I wouldn't say it's lawless. I would say it's different from our laws. I'm not talking up Russia at all. I'm saying as long as you have places like that, these laws are going to run into that barrier that rich people are just going to move their money. And when you talk about, was it Phil Nicholson, you say, well, he didn't leave. The thing is, it's a quantitative comparison. Do enough of them leave for these laws not to be economically worthwhile? Now, you made a case that, at least according to Rolling Stone, in this case in California with some of the tax hikes, which of course weren't remotely the regulations that you're proposing, maybe it worked out. And maybe it did. I don't have the numbers in front of me. Maybe it did.
Supposedly the revenues were higher than they were expecting.
But we don't know that that's what it's attributed to. And this is a very, very small tax hike. Tax hikes are very different from regulatory changes. So it's just, I am very skeptical about economic regulation as a means of helping the poor. It's not that I don't want to help the poor, and I don't want better equality. It's just I don't think this is the way to do it. But I think a lot of the kind of the popular anger and the popular discontent with inequality goes that route. And then inequality is still the same, but these people feel accomplished because, hey, we got an extra dollar in our paycheck. Yeah, but everything costs more. Look around. and you bankrupted the social safety net that you're dependent on. But it's just, a lot of, we're talking about people who are not very educated, who don't have a huge grounding in economics, so they don't think that far, unfortunately. And it's sad. But, yeah.
I did want to acknowledge, and I did on the page, the recent passing, and it wasn't unexpected, of Nelson Mandela. Interesting man to read about, who he really came from nothing, too. If you read about his childhood, he was born in a very small tribal area of, I believe it was Western South Africa. And I think he had gone back there after having served as president, the first non-white president of South Africa, of course. And it's interesting, and I've tried learning about South Africa, and being an American and a product of American public high school, I pretty much don't learn anything about history aside from Pilgrims and Mayflower and Columbus sailed the ocean blue and, Lincoln, and you don't learn anything about South Africa. And it's a very interesting, complicated place with a very kind of sort of fragmented history of colonialism from the Dutch, colonialism from the British, basically the apartheid, obviously, that went on for a long, long time. And it's really crazy to read about because it reads like what someone might imagine someone who's really anti Confederacy in America would think of the Confederate States of America, how they would have been run if they had survived as a country. Only if they had taken that idea of basically subjugating black people and ran with it. And that's exactly how, when you read about the history of South Africa, it's crazy. Like, when you think of Jim Crow, and if you're against how unjust that was, this was taken to the next level of that kind of idea of literally the races didn't mix. You had your side of the city to live on, and the white people had their side of the city to live on. And you weren't allowed to work at certain places. You weren't allowed to be in certain parts of the city without a white chaperone. There was a lot of really crazy laws. You couldn't, I think you were put to death if you tried to date a white woman. I don't even know. There was a lot of crazy laws. And this is what he came out of, Mandela, facing that kind of oppression. People think of MLK. Yeah, he faced a lot, but this is why a lot of people have been tipping their hats to Mandela, because you think of how bad that was in Birmingham in 1959. It was, 20 times worse, 100 times worse in Johannesburg.
Yeah. I mean, and the thing about it, and I admittedly don't know as much as I should about South Africa. Like you said, it's not.
Same here. I admit it. Right? Yeah, admittedly.
And my specialty with IR is mostly it's either South America or the Middle East. So South African countries are not something I know a lot about. I should really read up on it. I haven't really had a chance to. What I understand with Mandela, and a lot of places that I frequent, there's a lot of stupid people who are very idealistic, and they don't know their ass from a hole in the ground, and they're kind of an embarrassment because a lot of them are libertarians. A lot of them are very, anti-government, and they kind of have the right idealistic mindset, but they're so fucking ignorant that, they make progressives screaming, raise the minimum wage to $15 look smart. It's really pathetic.
The Alex Jones libertarians?
Right. And what I've been seeing a lot come out of those sources is, Mandela was a communist. And
right.
He was big government, and now everyone's talking him up, and you need to remember that. And from what I understand, again, my knowledge of this is not as extensive as it is on some topics, but from what I understand is Mandela kind of was the South African MLK in many ways. He was this inspirational labor leader that was kind of following in the ways of Gandhi.
Forget how pro-labor MLK was, by the way. But
anyway. He was started out as a labor organizer. How can you forget it?
That was what he was going to be turning his attention to when he got assassinated. He was talking about going back to that and pushing that more.
I disagree with you there. I think it was already kind of the groundwork had been laid because a lot of what Saul Alinsky did was unite the different unions. And MLK, of course, the black unions in the South.
Right.
We think now of unions as a single entity, but if you look at the history of unions in the 1920s, a lot of the minority unions and the white unions were at each other's throats. And they didn't like each other.
No.
Right, and even ethnic unions, you're talking about ethnic enclaves in Chicago or in New York, Italian unions versus Irish unions. They did not like each other. All these mafias, you hear about Irish mafia versus Italian mafia. The union and the mafia guys were the same guys. I mean,
some of the episodes of Boardwalk Empire in the last season were talking about that.
Right.
Actually, Capone against these Irish guys in Chicago.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So Alinsky, what his whole thing was, hey, Stop throwing rocks at each other because you go to a different church. Let's go take on the government. Let's go take on the corporations. Let's go demand equality. And that actually worked.
Let's all throw our rocks at them instead.
And it was amazing how well that worked. Like, it was scary because you had a guy, it really wasn't MLK, it was Alinsky. MLK was the leader of a specific group within that larger alliance. And we forget that. So, yeah, MLK definitely had the right idea with labor. And labor, it's an easy thing to organize, and he knew how to organize it. But going back to Mandela, his thing was really, it was all about peace organizing. There's a lot of conflict organizing, but it was Gandhi-type stuff, sitting down in front of a factory, refusing to work, or staging a sit-in, letting them beat you up so you're the victim, and then turning others to your cause by doing that. It's amazing how well that works. Mm-hmm. Whereas a lot of people surrounding him, a lot of other leaders, for one of him, there were about 10 Malcolm X's, who were black nationalists, very militant. A lot of them had a lot of kind of radical leftist views on labor and communism and socialism, and basically advocating violent takeover, violent revolution. And when you have a country with the population ratio of minority to majority, where the minority outnumbers the majority at least 5 or 6 to 1, I've read it was more like 9 to 1 at some points,
it was,
blacks to whites.
Yeah, the white rule was population-wise, was a very small portion.
Right. That's not an unlikely scenario. That can happen. And I mean, if you look at Haiti, they've had a few of those minority revolutions that were extremely bloody and not very effective. They threw out, the ruling minority, basically. And what have they accomplished? I mean, this is.
They fight with each other for power.
Right. This doesn't work. I mean, it sounds great, and it lets a lot of people get it out of their system, all their anger, but it's not long-term productive. So Mandela was always kind of the voice of reason and the voice of peace, and he eventually succumbed to violent methods. And a lot of this talks about how he eventually basically held hands with a lot of the violent leaders and a lot of the radical communists, and he said, you know what? This is the only way this is going to work here. We're so oppressed, and the government is so violent, and it's so repressive that we're only going to win by being violent back.
And he only did it after having tried, you're right, as you point out, the lesser violent stuff. And it wasn't so much that he liked doing it. It was sort of like he had to hold his nose and, well, you know what, at some point we have to, if we're going to get our goal eventually of full integrated South Africa, the full democracy, we're going to have to at some point resort to tactics that are, let's say, less than ideal. But, I guess the counterbalance to that is what they were doing, the government was so bad. They kind of had it coming to some degree.
Oh, they did. But the other thing is this. It makes me wonder, because Mandela himself, I mean, he led this rebellion, and it succeeded eventually. And when he became president, which was only for one term, he very much showed that he was not going to condone these same violent methods and a reverse repression, which is kind of what happened in the USSR, once he was in power. They did it to throw out the government, and he was one of the few actual politicians that kept his word. He's like, no, we're not tolerating radical black nationalist leftism here now that we are done with the apartheid. That's not happening. You run around trying to do that, you're going to get locked up.
And so, and obviously, he spent 27 years in prison. He became a kind of a cult figure in prison, both nationally and internationally at that time. And it was the pressure on them from the international community that finally he gets let out, and 4 years later becomes president. And not to forget, he was president, but he worked with de Klerk, who was the ruling white president. And they had this kind of transitional government, and that was part of his idea of, I don't just come take over. We work in tandem for a while, just to kind of reinforce that whole, we're integrated now, we're one country now. There was a lot of, those are all his ideas. You're right, and he did do a lot of things. I know that there was a movie made about this, the rugby team in '95. Like, he went under the pitch wearing that team's jersey, and that was something that was only really cheered for by the white population of the country at the time. The black population really didn't like the rugby team and would actually boo them at rugby matches when they would play other African countries. There was a lot of really bitter feelings, and Mandela himself actually separated and divorced his wife Winnie, who had supported him through prison, because she would not let the violent thing go. She kept going behind his back and doing kind of little terrorist acts here and there. He kept telling her to stop, and finally he's like, you know what, we're done. If you want to do this, you're doing it on your own.
And I feel like a lot of it, going off of that, if Mandela hadn't espoused the violence to an extent, I feel like it would have happened anyway. All the seeds were planted, and the other leaders would have still taken over South Africa. It would have been a massive genocide against all the white people in South Africa, which, even though they're the ruling majority, most of them didn't deserve to die. And that's exactly what would have happened. They would have gotten lynched.
De Klerk would have been lynched instead of holding his hand up with Mandela. Yeah.
Right. I mean, if you think about, you have people that have for generations lived in slums. They have about 6 grades of education, and they're just reduced to menial labor, and they're just treated like just almost like slaves, even though they're not really slaves. And now you give them carte blanche to go attack the white part of town. You think they're going to think about who's guilty and who's not? No, they aren't. They're going to lynch everyone and burn and loot the entire place. And then you're going to end up with Haiti because I hate to say it, but they don't know how to govern themselves. Not for any eugenic reasons, because they've been kept under the boot for multiple generations. They haven't been educated. So I feel like if Mandela hadn't done that, that would have been the alternative.
He provided the example by which he led by example. He's one of those people that you could say led by example.
He really did, yes. So I feel like a lot of the attacks on him, because of his involvement in the violence, are somewhat, unjustified for that reason. It would have happened anyway.
Well, and the knock on him is this is something I read this morning. Somewhere on the internet, it was the message manipulation of Mandela. How a lot of let's even say Obama, but to some extent, like other world leaders that talk about his example and talk about their support of him and their image of him and how much of a hero he was, while at the same time conducting themselves or supporting policies that are completely against what he stood for. And a lot of people don't know this, and I didn't know this until he died. He was actually on the United States terror watch list until 2008, when he was age 90.
If only we could control all those 90-year-old men that are out of politics.
That Mandela guy.
Al-Qaeda would just go away. I mean, come on.
He might come here and start blowing shit up.
He might blow himself up. He's old. He's got nothing to lose. It's embarrassing.
It's because embarrassing. He was a threat to that. And really what it was is part of that's corporation-driven. Politicians follow corporations, and he scared the corporations because not only was he for integrated South Africa, which was a threat to their interests in a lot of ways, because of the cheap labor, for one thing. And that's where it all started. He was a labor leader because what was the number one problem besides simple racism, simple discrimination, was the fact that they were basically, like you said, treated like slave labor and not paid equally.
Indentured servants, more like, but yeah. And the thing is, people forget that as all this is going on mid to late 20th century in South Africa, a lot of the support that ruling minority had was from foreign countries. Not necessarily so much the U.S., but Britain. It was a former British colony. So a lot of British interests, or Dutch interests, French. A lot of foreign influence that even though, on paper they're like, yeah, you really ought to treat your indentured servants better and protect their human rights. But what they're really saying, but don't do it in any way that impedes on our profits in your country.
Yeah, it's kind of like Apple going, we fully support equal worker rights at Foxconn for Chinese labor, but don't raise your prices on what iPods cost. So however you can do that.
Yeah,
that's what they say outwardly, and then what they whisper behind it, but don't actually,
And if you look at South American history, which I understand a lot more, if you look at guys like Fulgencio Batista in Cuba or the Somoza family in Nicaragua, and on paper, a lot of the U.S., even though they supported these guys, are like, yeah, they could basically treat their indigenous populations that are treated like indentured servants better. But in reality, you have all these corporate investments there, and that's who's keeping them in power. And then when you have the Castros and the Sandinos come in and lynch these guys, like, well, who the fuck created them?
Right.
Where would they come from? So I feel like with Nelson Mandela, he kind of fell under the same boot because you had all these black militants coming up. And the more the British corporations and the French and the Dutch and the American, the foreign corporations painted them as monsters. And of course they were wearing the communist label, which mid-20th century, that's the enemy of humanity, is communism. That's the number one enemy. The more you could marginalize them and basically delay any real reform. And the more you do that, the more your opposition grows militant and wants to lynch you as opposed to take over non-violently. So I feel like if it weren't for Nelson Mandela, the outcomes would have been a whole lot worse in that sense in South Africa, and not in favor of the British.
He's one guy that definitely, in my opinion, he deserves his place in history. A lot of people, are sort of they have an image that doesn't jive with the reality of their. I think in his case, it's well deserved, and him having a Peace Prize that makes sense. Fucking Obama having a Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize, ridiculous,
Oh,
ridiculous.
well, I mean, the Nobel Peace Prize hasn't really meant anything in a long time, unfortunately. But
Probably since he won it, Mandela.
I don't know. I think it's more well, yeah, probably that was the last legitimate person that deserved to receive it. Although I don't know. I mean, Henry Kissinger.
Oh my god, that guy should be in jail for crimes.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know about him. The Peace Prize. I have a few concerns regarding that.
He's the one that tried to call off the Paris peace talks until Nixon got elected. By the way.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Now, here's the thing. If you look at South Africa now, who's in charge, of course, is Jacob Zuma, who is also a former black militant leader, not remotely as consensus-oriented and peace-oriented as Mandela. And it's interesting how these guys that are radical and militant, once they're in power, how quickly they turn around and bend over for the same guys they were rebelling against. Because now they're on the profiting end. It's amazing what happens. And this guy, I mean, I have read some of the most disturbing shit about him. This is a guy who spent years in exile, running around Central Africa because he was also on all the terror watch lists. And I mean, this was not Nelson Mandela. He was not like widely respected in the rest of the world. And even though he was on there, he was in prison in South Africa. You couldn't just knock him off. This is more of a Joseph Kony type guy. And this guy's president now, and on paper he's like, yeah, I'm black militant. He's supposedly more radical left than Nelson Mandela. But what he really does is basically restrict civil liberties and restrict any kind of free expression that fucks with his authority. And what he's doing is slowly opening South Africa back up to foreign investment, basically by bending over and removing all the stuff that Nelson Mandela and his people put in place. But he's black, and he has that history, so it's a lot more difficult to accuse him of that. I mean, it's not necessarily along racial lines intentionally, but of course, this is not something that's fixed in one generation, the economic gap there. So it's really kind of following that same paradigm. A lot of this happened in South America. After you had all these populist revolutions, but they really didn't work economically, then you have what's referred to by international relations theory as neoliberalism, where you have the modern governments that are not remotely as oppressive as the Batistas, but they're still economically doing the same thing. They're just basically selling their country to foreign investment. And that's what Zuma is doing. So, again, if this could happen there, despite Nelson Mandela, I'm terrified to think of what would be going on there if it weren't for him.
Yeah, it's true. Another commie I wanted to bring up. The Pope.
Oh, jeez. That
Francis.
just makes me laugh.
Pope Francis.
Okay, I'm sorry. Where the fuck does the pontiff get authority on economics? And I don't care which direction he's going. I didn't like it when Benedict was opening his mouth about it. I didn't like it when John Paul II was opening his mouth about it. So no one's going to come up here and tell me, oh, you just don't like it because he's being liberal. Well, no, you didn't hear me talking about the last two, and those are the only two that have been around since I've been alive.
Well,
so
it was, well, I think that he was coming at it from the having worked with the poor perspective. But then again, I would argue that in Argentina, which is not a trickle-down type system as ours has been at times.
I would say Argentina is more of a trickle-down type system. It just depends on, it's very corrupt.
Depends on who's in charge, I guess.
Here's the thing. Having worked with the poor, having that experience of working with the poor does not make you an expert on economics. I'm sorry, that's like saying that because someone's worked at McDonald's making $1 over minimum wage for 30 years, that makes him an expert on the minimum wage. No, it doesn't. What are his credentials? And I am very, very skeptical of this new pope, since we're bringing him up. I have looked into his history.
That's interesting.
And some of the history.
I kind of like him.
Well, here's the thing.
I'm not Catholic.
I kind of like some of the stuff he's done with the church so far. I'll give him that. So far,
he has called them off the gays. Is one thing he did. Is leave them alone. He said, you know what? You shouldn't judge. You know, God said, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." So you know what? Us standing in judgment of them is no different than them standing in judgment of us. So we shouldn't do it. Leave them alone.
And I appreciate that.
Argument. That's not even really a religious argument.
I have to, yeah, I have to give him credit for that. He's also slapped around a few cardinals and bishops that had built themselves multi-million-dollar mansions.
Yes, he did.
With Catholic money, and he's like, right, you know what? You're fired. Get the fuck out of here.
And for perspective, when they call a conclave, which is when they all come in, all fly in from all over the world to pick another pope, there's this kind of dorm room apartment building in the Vatican they all live in. And I think it's actually live two to a room when they're there to pick the pope. So it's basically just these little apartment hotel room things.
Right.
When he became pope, he never moved out of his. He stayed in it. He's not living in the big fancy papal residence like the other popes did. And actually Benedict has like fancier digs as the Pope Emeritus than the current Pope does, because he doesn't. He's very much about the not putting on airs, the not, living his own life. He rode the bus in Argentina.
Well, I mean, Benedict loved to run his mouth about helping the poor and wealth redistribution, while sitting on his fucking golden throne. It's like, dude,
I had the least respect for. He was
just shut up. You're an idiot, right?
And he was like the Mitt Romney of popes.
Really?
A total insider type. Like,
he's more like a Newt Gingrich, I would say, than a Mitt Romney.
Loft, he was alongside John Paul II all that time, and a lot of people say was directly able to stop the abuse scandal things that were going on. That those all came to his desk at some point. Like, it was him.
Buck stops here.
And so there's a lot of questions, about that too.
And it's interesting that Francis is doing the opposite. He's investigating this shit, and just the mere fact that you have that policy. No, this comes to my desk. I'm coming over there, and I'm finding out what the fuck it is. Just that alone is going to deter a lot of these abuses, because they're like, holy shit, Pope Francis is going to come rolling into town and just fire us all. Be like, that's it. Get the fuck out of my church. This is not acceptable behavior. And I think it's long overdue. So I have to give him credit. But that being said, first of all, he has a very, very shady past in Argentina. Now, Argentina, I know a lot more about than South Africa, and I'm not going to get into the details. The history of that country is just depressing. If you think Chile with Pinochet is bad, look into the history of Argentina.
All anyone knows about Argentina is Evita.
Well, Juan Perón, right. That was actually, Juan Perón, believe it or not, was actually more of a leftist populist leader. He actually took power twice, not once. That movie does not make a very good point of that.
Movie with Madonna in it is an historic.
Yeah, really, yeah, and Antonio Banderas. But it's he was a general, obviously, and it was sort of part military coup, part elections. But he was only in power, I want to say, a total of about 10 years. Right. And before and since then, it's just been one military coup after another. And it's like Pakistan, someone gets elected and they get couped out. It's a clusterfuck.
Yeah.
It's a nightmarishly complicated and brutal country politically. And being a high-ranking member of the Catholic Church, which Argentina is very Catholic, in that country, it's difficult not to have a shady history. So there's various accounts of like one of the dictatorial governments kidnapping priests and him being party to this because those priests were speaking out against it. And if you remember, like if you're a ranking member of the Catholic Church, you're one of the few people in position to stand up to the dictatorship in Argentina. But then Francis has come out and said he admitted his role in these things, in their abductions and their repressions, but he said if it weren't for me, they would have killed those priests. I made sure they survived. I used my influence to do that.
Right.
But they were basically beat to shit and like left out in the field somewhere, so they'd shut up. But I couldn't stop it. So I have a difficult. I don't know the man. It's shady. And the records. South America is notoriously bad at keeping records for things like this. Is it Argentina, Brazil, Chile, all those countries. So it's difficult to find out where he really came from, but I think he has a bit of a shady past. Which is fine. I mean, okay, I can see a lot of popes do.
Everyone down there would have a shady past.
And most popes kind of have a shady past. I mean, Benedict was a member of the Hitler Youth.
Yeah. You don't want to know the past of Benedict, yeah.
Right, he was a
scandal. It's only where it starts.
Yeah,
don't forget his real name was Ratzinger, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. You do the math on that name there, people.
No, he was a. There's a. If you Google image his name, you will find a photograph of him as a 12-year-old in a Nazi uniform. There's no.
It's like being a Cub Scout back then. You just
Well, the thing is, his excuse is he had no choice. He had no say in the matter. All the boys were drafted.
12, that's true in a lot of ways.
Who knows? But this is the thing. There's a lot of
hope someday I can't, Mom and Dad.
Yeah, that's not happening, right? And the thing is, a lot of these popes have shady histories, and the Catholic Church is not like a typical Western democracy where you get to find out everything you want about the politicians. So, leaving the shady past as it is, I still want to know, and despite some of the good things he's done with the church so far, what the fuck gives him the authority to talk about economics? What does he know about economics? Working with the poor in Argentina does not qualify.
Well, I mean, I don't know about his educational history. It's possible that he's educated himself. I mean, being a religious figure gives you a lot of time to read.
We can't just assume that.
Well, no, I'm just saying that just like you could, let's say, assume that he didn't, I could just easily assume that he did.
But I think the burden of proof, if you're going to say, okay, he's qualified to talk about it, the burden of proof lies on the guy that says he does, not that he doesn't.
I'm not saying he is, but I will say that I think that he would be the first to admit, yeah, I'm a pope. I have a pulpit and a microphone to speak into, and so if I have an opinion today, I'm going to talk into the microphone about my opinion. He's from what I've understood, like how a lot of popes, you have to arrange an interview, you have to set aside time. This guy gives quotes on flights back from, he went to Argentina as his first trip back as a pope. And when he came back on the plane is where he said that "leave the gays alone" quote, and he was just spitballing with these guys. It's when you make a big trip like that, everybody goes all in one group. There's the press that's embedded with the group, right. And there's the entourage, and they're all on the same plane. So when they were mulling around, usually though the person is not mulling around with the reporters. In this case, he came right over to them and just started talking. He's not a very closed off guy. He's an extremely right up front kind of guy.
I don't see how that makes him an expert on economics. I'm sorry. It's great. I love it. Okay? Thanks. I appreciate it, Francis, but how does that make him an expert in economics?
You asked the question, what makes him think he just does?
That wasn't the question. The question was what makes him an expert, because I'm not so concerned with what he's saying. I'm concerned with just this feverish wave now of progressives quoting him. Look, we're right because the Pope agrees with us, which is so hysterical.
That is kind of interesting.
Because those same people, the same exact individuals, I could name them by name, but I'm not going to.
Progressive Catholics like Kennedy.
Oh, they're even if they aren't Catholics. Okay, 2-3 years ago, these same people were saying all kinds of quote unquote positive things about Benedict, and saying, "Fuck you. You're attacking the gays, you're against contraception, you're a fucking crazy asshole," citing his Nazi history, all that.
Well, that's the opposite of that, though.
Right, so somehow the Pope... Wait. The Pope wasn't an authority for them then. But now that the Pope is saying what they agree with, now all of a sudden, look, the Pope says this, therefore it must be true. Bullshit!
I think part of it is just they're so amazed he said it. But
that's not what I'm referring to.
You can't look at the last 30 years of America with a trickle-down system we've had. And you can't argue that we don't have it because the tax rates bear that out. And say that it achieves economic equality and prosperity because it hasn't.
Okay. Yes, I agree. I agree. I'm not saying it does.
At any time that a person who's, let's say, in favor of such a policy would say that it did, were just times where even you agree we were blowing bubbles, not actually...
No, I agree completely. The problem is this Pope,
that's what he was saying.
Because he has no grounding in economics, that's not what he was saying, Joe. He was equating that system with all its imaginary Laffer curves and trickle-down fantasy crap
Yes.
to a free market economics. If you don't know the difference between free market economics and trickle-down economics, you need to shut the fuck up about economics.
Wait, he equated them?
Yes, he did. He called that capitalism. He called it the free market. I mean, you have to read the speech. We can read it if you want, but he absolutely did not make a distinction. Now, interestingly, he didn't say a whole lot in favor of socialism or more leftist economics. I think a lot of progressives took it to mean that no, he was just attacking the existing system, which is interesting, right? He didn't say, oh, we need a more Keynesian system, we need more egalitarian laws. No, he didn't say anything in favor of anything. He attacked the trickle-down system, but he equated it openly to the free market and to capitalism.
He did in that speech, but I think he has said other things that make him sound like a socialist type, though.
And I don't know enough. I don't have the data right in front of me. Right, but that's the thing, is if you don't understand the difference between those two things, you need to shut up about economics. That's my thing. That's why I'm saying he's not. If he really does not understand the difference, he's not qualified to discuss it. Because when you have that kind of audience, when you have that kind of authority, just you come up and you say something, and the entire world is like, wow, the Pope said that, you really kind of have to have some responsibility for the shit you say. Or you're just spreading ignorance.
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on how you take what he said, but I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to see. I didn't see this coming. A pope that was going to be so in tune with today. Like I kept thinking that they'd pick some other completely out of touch guy, and that one argument aside of economics, you have to admit that he's in line with a lot of the way societies are just kind of turning in the Western world these days.
I would disagree with you.
That tolerance idea of gays, leave them alone even if you don't support it. Don't prosecute these guys.
I would disagree completely with you. I would say that the Catholic Church, and I don't have research to go back to the 17th century with this, but just looking at the last 3 or 4 popes, I would say the Pope culturally is always behind the times. On the world. I know that's not what the 2 billion Catholics in the world want to hear, but I'm still going to say it.
Well, they are just because they're so old, but...
And as one, they're old. 2, the Catholic Church is generally a pretty conservative institution.
But he jumped way forward ahead of all the other ones.
See, I disagree with you. That's the thing. What I'm saying is, if you look at Benedict, Benedict wasn't Pope for very long. He was almost like an interim Pope. Yeah. But if you look at John Paul II, a lot of his views and his political theories, because being Pope is very political, it was really kind of mid-20th century stuff that he was peddling.
Oh, and he was by the time he was
right, and it was just so outdated because he died in the 21st century. Now, Benedict was more like going back to like the 1800s, but we won't go there.
And Benedict was not much younger than John Paul II, really. He's 80.
Right, he's very old. Yeah. Now, Francis, I would say, the stuff he's peddling is like 1960s, 1970s, maybe 1980s. What he's saying, it was progressive then. It's not progressive now. I would say society is way ahead of him culturally. I would say that culture of tolerate the gays, trickle-down economics is shit. And really if you're saying he's advocating for socialism, that is not a new idea. No matter how much progressives want to talk about the idea, it's not.
No.
So
neither is free market capitalism. But
no, it's not. Actually, I would say free market capitalism is a newer idea than socialism. If you look at when, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek did their work versus Thomas More and Daniel Webster, the free market is actually a newer idea, believe it or not. Trickle-down is the newest of them all, but still. So if you look at this, and if you look at, he's a socialist, and he's talking about tolerating the gays, and he's talking about just being basically a liberal, in a sense, which there's nothing wrong with being a liberal. I would say the general populist political thought has kind of been on that train for the last 20, 30 years. Institutions take longer to catch up, so a lot of governments, especially in very undemocratic places like Argentina, haven't caught on. But this is where the politics has been. And the Catholic Church is finally catching on, just as there's a new tide rising that's really not there anymore. Socialism is not popular with our generation or the next one. No matter how much Obama and the Rachel Maddows like to pretend that it is, it's not.
I was actually reading something recently that said it basically said the opposite of what you were saying, and I'd have to like get the data
I know
out to actually quote
exactly
it.
what you're talking about. There was an article. It was an article praising and basically blowing Elizabeth Warren.
No, this was not what I read.
Okay, well maybe that's not what you read, but what they I'm sure they cited the same data. It was a data point that basically what they said was, look, all of a sudden the young people from 18 to 24 or whatever favor socialism more than capitalism.
It was 18 to 35 was what I read.
Yeah, the actual
The
data.
quote unquote millennial group.
It's
Maybe it was
18 to
34, but it was
29. It's actually, well, that group breaks down into three subgroups: 18 to 24, 25 to 29, and 20 or 30 to 34.
the thing I read was 18 to 34, and what it said was that we take different ideals from the older generation and the newer kind of generation and sort of make our own way. We don't buy wholesale. That was the overall like kind of trend it was noting, but that the overall trend was against a limited government model. That was actually the minority opinion amongst.
I didn't see. That's not what I saw at all. With the I saw the data on this from Pew, and the data said there was exactly one group of those three, only one subgroup. That was the 18 to 24 group that actually viewed socialism more favorably than capitalism, and the difference was 49% to 48%. So really, statistically speaking, that's breaking even. Now you can take it however you want. I'm really not seeing that. You also have to adjust this for history. If you look at young people that were this age 15 years ago, 20 years ago, this generation, and you look at how much they favored the left when they were that age, they don't favor it anymore. Now they're older. They're actually they had a much more favorable view of the left than we do. So you have people's views change over their lifespans. They're not going to be the same all the time. So they're saying, oh, look, the young still skew overwhelmingly toward Democrats and Obama. Well, that's true.
Well, actually, what I was reading, it wasn't Obama. It was more of a more progressive kind of Elizabeth Warren-y. Not that she was used as an example, but that kind of a mindset.
And it's probably right. The problem is it's cherry-picked. If you took that same generational demographic from, say, the late 1970s, and you looked at who of them favored Walter Mondale or Jimmy Carter, you looked at the percentage by which they favored him, and you compare that today to someone like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, you will find they've lost about 20%. Because you shouldn't just presume that they're going to continue to support the same type of politician as they get older, because they're not. The previous generations didn't. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll see. So, it's just interesting to note.
I think that my concern with this, I mean, the data is real. My concern is that it's used in a very deceptive, misleading way. It's used to say, see, the young are liberal, and so the future is liberal. No, the young are actually less liberal today than they've been for the last 70 years. So if you make that historical comparison accurately, that's not that idea, oh, the future is liberal, it's just not there.
Actually, what I was seeing described, part of what I was seeing them describe was, it sounded a lot like me, quite frankly, because it was like they're concerned about the environment, but they're also concerned about consumer rights. They're concerned about privacy violations and making unnecessary wars, but they're also, concerned about the poor and equality and equal rights for homosexuals, things like that. So it's interesting. I mean, it's just, I don't know what you would call that.
Sounds libertarian to me.
But a lot of it,
sounds libertarian.
And there's plenty of it you would agree with too, but there were certain other things that you wouldn't, like more liberal things. But that was the argument, is that there's a lot of taking a little from here, taking a little from there, which is exactly what I feel like I do. There's a lot of ways in which I'm a social libertarian, a lot of ways in which I'm kind of an economic progressive liberal. So,
and maybe I have to apologize. Maybe we're looking at the different data, and I'm assuming you're looking at the same data.
I guess, light of that.
Right. I feel like maybe I think you're looking at the same data as I am, but maybe you're not. There's different data. There's different research. Because it doesn't sound like it's exactly. I apologize for that, jumping the gun on that.
I might post more on our Facebook page and site.
Please do. We haven't heard as much from you as we have recently in past times.
It's been busy for me lately.
I understand. And on that note, I mean, there one more topic that I believe we wanted
I think there's one I'm just going to throw out. It's unrelated to anything political, but it was interesting nonetheless, the death of Paul Walker in a fiery, reckless car accident. Now, he wasn't the driver. I'll point that out right now. He wasn't the driver. So this isn't a screed against Paul Walker. His friend and business partner was the driver. They were driving a Porsche Carrera GT, which is, people don't know, it's a super Porsche, and is basically a barely street legal race car. So it's incredibly hard to drive. It doesn't have stability control, and people forget how much electronic shit is on cars these days that prevents you from wrecking. Like, cars are crazy technological masterpieces now compared to where they were 30 years ago.
Okay.
There's computers, controlling the skidding, controlling braking, controlling wheel control. The Carrera GT has none of that. And the estimates, preliminary estimates, were like, they had to have been going over 120, 150 miles an hour on a public street with a 45-mile-an-hour speed limit. Now, I know you're no fan of speed limits, but I think you'll agree with me, that's a bit excessive. Just a little bit.
Joe, honestly, I can see if you and I had a car like that we were driving down the street, I could see us doing exactly the same thing. This is normal.
But honestly, running into a tree or a light post like they did, it wouldn't be unexpected either, especially in that case.
Yeah, if you go 150 miles an hour, those bureaucrats are idiots that set those speed limits to 45. Maybe it's safe to go 60, but when you're going 4 times the speed limit, I can see some potential problems with that.
This wasn't quite the egregiousness of Ryan Dunn, the jackass guy, being drunk off his ass at a bar and then getting into his Porsche and doing up to 130-40 down the highway in Pennsylvania and going off the road so fast he hit a tree and there was just nothing left of the car. It vaporized on impact. That's not quite as bad as that, but you know what? Just a little reminder to all you might not just kill yourself. You might kill a friend in the car and someone else on the road. It's just, find an airport runway. Find a fucking racetrack. Seriously.
So that way only you die.
Fast and Furious, they're just movies, really. Don't try to replicate this shit in real life.
And, we don't know that that's what they were doing, but I can see where, like Fast and Furious, the movie.
Lots of, donut marks on the pavement, supposedly, too, right by the crash scene. Figure eights and skid marks.
So they felt like they were still in that movie, basically.
And I don't know, like I said, I don't know how much Walker was a party to this. Obviously it's a tragedy that he died, but you know what? When I see something like this, I feel sorry for his family and his daughter. He's a kid, and his wife or girlfriend, or people that he leaves behind, because it's horrible for them. But it's like, you know what? When you put yourself in that situation, and again, if he was an unwilling participant, he was just there, and this guy decided to just start going nuts in this car, it's another thing. But we have no way of knowing that one way or another, and it just seems like they were kind of really good friends for a long time. And it's quite possible he was enjoying what was happening at the league.
Somehow I doubt that he was an unwilling party. As I can see if two guys that have known each other forever, like you and I, we get in a car together like that, and we start being douchebags.
We're like, hey, try to see what this thing can do.
Right, the more you do, the more I'm going to be like, nah, Joe, you're a fucking pussy. Go faster. You can just see that, right? This isn't going to be...
We don't. But you're right. When I look at it objectively, it seems hard for me to believe that he would be, oh my God, what are you doing? Stop, we might hit something. When he's like kind of a self-described, car freak and adrenaline.
Probably not, right? And the thing is, shit like those movies. Like with Fast and Furious 6, the shit that they did in that movie, there were cartoonists saying, "Yeah, I wouldn't animate that."
Right.
I wouldn't animate that. Like fucking animation, Tom and Jerry's animation, and you have animators saying, "Yeah, that's just ridiculous." So. I'm not saying that these guys went this far, but yeah, I have to agree with you. Like, people have to think about, okay, the laws may be stupid, and they may be overprotective, and they may have ulterior motives.
There's wiggle room there, but 130, 40 in the middle of a city street? Come on, find a racetrack, seriously. And he's rich, he had no excuse. You know what I mean? It's like, there's time and place. And I think...
Paul Walker, legitimately, there's been a lot of talk about all the great things he did and all his charity work and all his pro bono work. So I respect the guy. And even though he maybe wasn't the greatest actor...
He did a lot of good for people.
But he really did a lot of good things. But this kind of...
You really hate the fact that he wasn't better about treating himself a certain way.
Right. Really.
It's like, why did you're doing these good things, why would you risk it all acting like an idiot?
Or when you're sitting next to your friend, act like an idiot.
Letting him act like an idiot, yeah. Either way.
It's a tragedy, but I think it's a reminder to people that, you have, no matter who you are, you have to have personal responsibility.
It just amazes me, like, this long after we have the deaths of people like James Dean and Steve McQueen, you think of those as being a long time ago when cars were little rattle traps and, roads were little dirt paths and shit. Oh, yeah, of course, those guys, they died in cars 50 years ago. That's what happened back then. You think of a guy like that, like, literally, that's our generation's version of those two things.
Really?
It's
Yeah.
the same death, and it's like, it's just as preventable now as it was then. And we could do a lot of things to a car to make them safe. But when you're going 130, believe me, it doesn't matter how many airbags your car has at that point. It
Oh
doesn't.
yeah, they're literally gonna wash you out with a hose at that
Physics.
point. Yeah.
Yes, the force vectors on that is still enough to turn you into hamburger meat. It doesn't matter anymore at that point, and it pretty much hit a light post and burst right into flames. So yeah, it's not good. And when you look at the crash scene on the CNN, there was nothing left of the car. It's gone. It's completely gone.
Didn't they say someone stole a part?
Well, here's the thing. It hit the light post so hard that it threw the starter through a plate glass window that was like 150 feet away from the scene.
Holy shit!
So
Wow.
this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about he was going 80 in a 45. No, he was going like 130.
And you're expecting to survive this?
You're not going to live.
Parts of your car are flying 150 feet away and still breaking windows, and you think you're going to survive?
Yeah. Right,
Wow.
and that's exactly. I guess I don't think the cops were saying was people have to stop. People are like squealing their tires. They're burning their tires out on the pavement when they drive by the crash scene in like remembrance. They're like chirping.
Oh, that's awesome! Now there's going to be some dumb shit kid that dies there next.
Here we go. This whole thing. It's amazing how that.
You know what? On that, there's something else I want to talk about real quick since we're talking about stupid, just public trends. This knockout game. And I had a very interesting conversation.
I wonder. There's like the reporting, but I only hear about it on Fox.
I've read in Reason magazine, which I trust 50 times to Fox's one, and I've had this conversation with a couple of very intelligent people that understand just media, just how media works very well. And it seems like this has always been a trend. It isn't necessarily called the knockout game, where stupid teenagers have this as a prank where they just have to start a fight or beat up or attack a random stranger.
Hell, it was like Fight Club.
Well, Fight Club is a movie. There's deep political undertones there. In the book, it's actually way deeper, cultural undertones. But just stupid teenagers will do shit like this. I remember when I was a teenager, I didn't do this, but I had friends who talked about, what we called it pulling a random, where you just attack a random person on the street. And I'm like, yeah, you're a fucking idiot.
Not a new idea. Yeah.
You're a fucking idiot. These guys are not breaking new ground.
They think they're cool. And that's what I heard. I heard Hannity like boo-hooing about this on his show, and I'm like, dude, this has been going on as long as there's been human beings. Aren't you? What are you talking about?
I mean, I'm sure Hannity did it himself when he was a kid.
He was acting like this was some like new scourge of society or something. He sounded like some old man.
They need something to bitch about for how badly they've been cornered, these neocons. But
all he needed was Snow White comb-over hair and a fucking cane to wave at the camera when he was talking about it.
Basically. So, I agree with you. So, I think it's a real thing, but I think the media is making a trend out of it when there's not. Right. But the problem is this has the reverse effect. If you make a trend out of it, and you glorify it, oh, look, these evil scourge kids. And, of course, it's always the racist undertones are just so present. It's always black kids attacking white old ladies. By the way, this is not only engaged in by black teenagers, and most of the time, if it is black teenagers, they're probably doing it against other black people because that's the neighborhood they're in. That's reality. Let's deal with it, please.
Yeah.
But this, now, you're glorifying it, and you're giving stupid teenagers the idea that, hey, this is a cool thing to do. So
you're decrying it, but if you hadn't made it your feature story at 6 o'clock news on TV that night, maybe the entire fucking country would now know about it.
Well, just like the dumbasses that want to go by the wreckage of Paul Walker's car and peel out and squeal their tires, like, you didn't learn anything? He died doing that.
Right.
Hello?
Right.
Maybe you shouldn't do what he did and died. Just get the thought, hey, he died doing that. Let's go do that. But this is how teenagers' minds work. They're idiots.
It's right, yeah.
So if you show them a video of some dumb shit kid that gets out of his car and tries to tase some random guy, and the guy turns out to have a gun and points a gun and just blows his ass out, it's like, hey, your behavior has consequences, right?
Right.
Dumb shit kids looking at this, they're not going to think we shouldn't do that. We're going to get shot. They think, hey, that's a cool thing to do. And if we don't get shot, then we'll be cooler than that guy. Wow. If we don't die doing this dumb shit in our raced fucking Mustangs, then we're going to be cooler than Paul Walker. It's like, really? but the media's got to take some responsibility for this. I mean, the thing is, this is not responsible journalism. This is not accurate reporting. Yeah, you're not trying to glorify it. You're trying to make it sound like the scourge of society. But I'm sorry, when Sean Hannity or Rush Limbaugh try to make something sound like the scourge of society, you're bound to have a few people that want to do it, just because those guys are assholes.
It reminds me of the South Park when the no smoking like dance troupe comes to school, and they're like doing their little fake rap skits and stuff for the kids, like, don't smoke and you'll turn into us. And next thing you see is the kids behind the school learning to smoke.
Uh-huh.
Because they're so lame, they're like, oh my god, if we don't smoke, we're going to turn into them.
If they think of it, they'll think of it for you.
Next thing you go, why are we smoking these things? They're so gross. You don't want to turn into those dorks, do you? Okay. So fun.
It's so true.
Yeah.
We had, when I was a kid, when I was in middle school, we had a lot of we had this ridiculous trend of kids boring holes in pennies and dimes, like in change, and then wearing them as necklaces.
I think I remember that.
Stupid 12-year-olds, again, they'll do shit like that. Now, it was probably one distinct group of like 5 kids that did that and got caught. The problem is that's a federal crime. Defacing currency, not cute. So how did the middle school react? They made an announcement to the whole school of 1,200 students. Don't do this, it's a federal crime. You know what happened the next day?
Everybody had them.
You had 30 kids with a penny for a fucking necklace. Morons! Again, these are supposed to be professional educators. You would think they'd understand that's a stupid idea.
The herd mentality is very
so,
strong
it goes back to what we're talking about, the Pope and Nelson Mandela, and even to an extent, the minimum wage hikes. I think this is a good place to end, is public expression, especially if you have an audience and you're someone who's important and you have a captive audience. You really kind of have a responsibility to think about what you're saying and think about the message you're saying. I'm not advocating for laws that restrict us. I'm just asking people to think about what the fuck they're saying. And the reason I'm so aggressive in stepping on people who just say complete bullshit as if it's reality and insist on it based on their authority just with people in their audience is because this is dangerous. You're spreading misinformation, and this just rots society. And we've had cases where you've caught me doing that, and I appreciate it. I appreciate being called out on that. Because
I do the same.
I mean, we all do it. But it's like, you have to. The difference between us and Sean Hannity is that we take responsibility when we do that, and we retract our statements. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think, yes, we fucked up. We said this, and it was wrong. Like, for example, on our last show,
which happened?
We were talking about the cult in Tokyo that bought the recipe for chemical weapons from a U.S. military contractor in Maryland. It's real cute, and killed a bunch of people in the subway. And I insisted that was in the late 80s, and then you showed me, no, that was in 1995, asshole. So, now they probably bought them in the late 80s. They bought the recipe, we don't know, but because that's when a lot of that trend was. But this is when the actual attack happened, because this is a fact.
Well, that's just an innocent thing of dates, not like a trend.
The point is, as someone with a captive audience, as people with a captive audience, even though our audience obviously isn't the Pope or even Sean Hannity, unfortunately, if we have a responsibility to not spread a falsehood.
Because, if I declare something as fact, I at least I want to feel like I have some basis in saying so.
Right.
And if I don't, and I say that it was, and then I turn out to be wrong, I want to kind of cop to that because there's a certain amount of trust that's placed in you. Right. And you're obligated, I think, in my opinion, to honor.
Right. And I'd far rather have my credibility based on the fact that when I fuck up, I cop to it, than just have people who are zombies who are just bowing down to me because they agree with what I'm saying, even though it's complete bullshit. Like, I had a run-in this morning on a forum with some folks that posted what they claimed was a Chris Matthews quote, saying something about how Obama has never done anything wrong. I forget the exact wording, but it was about how everything's transparent, everything's great, crystal clear, he's not a criminal, just basically leave him alone.
And it was a bullshit quote, right?
Well, I'm not sure that it was. I saw it, right? And like I mean, I bash Obama constantly. That's not a problem. And my radical response was to say this sounds fishy. Just because someone made a meme of Chris Matthews saying this doesn't mean he really said it, right?
Yeah,
So
manipulated quotes are like the easiest thing to spread on the internet.
all right, well, what is that?
I saw like a Facebook quote where it was like, "Oh, people can invent air quotes from anything," and it's Abraham Lincoln.
Right, that's a common meme. Yeah. The problem with quotes on the internet is that no one checks their sources.
Abraham Lincoln, yeah.
Right? Yeah, that's how it is. So I called them out on this, and they post a video of him actually saying something very similar. So okay, he said it, according to them. And then they start attacking me. Oh yeah, you damn liberals, and they're calling me a liberal. That's hysterical.
That's
and
really
yeah,
funny.
you're. Oh, now how does it feel to be wrong? I'm like, okay, so you idiots are marginalizing me as a liberal, as this is my response to them, because when I see accusations against another human being, I question the source. I ask for evidence. That's called a reasonable response. What you're doing, the fact that you just accept this source because you don't like Obama, makes you A, batshit stupid, and B, you're really being just like Chris Matthews. You're doing the exact same thing, only for the other side.
And that, yeah, and I frequently hate when my side, quote unquote, a side I agree with on an issue, resorts to the same misinformation tactics. I believe that if your side of the argument is the correct one, in your opinion, then you shouldn't do it a disservice by being dishonest, disingenuous, manipulating facts, using dishonest tactics, arguing in bad faith. It's not a good thing to do, and it doesn't do your cause any service either. And, it would be nice to, if Obama had that kind of accountability in himself and administration, then the Obamacare website might actually fucking work.
Well, no, I think that's going a bit far, Joe.
Well, I can dream, so.
Yeah, exactly. And, honestly, I love how now, okay, the website kind of works. It's not as bad as it was. And a lot of people are moving on to the next thing to attack Obamacare for. Which, there's been a few things, and there's been, like the raising premiums, and it's like, what did you expect? Did you think that all the opponents of this thing, when it has 40% approval rating, would just fold up and be like, oh, okay, the website works now. Yeah, it's great. Right, no, yeah. This thing is doomed, and it's doomed because of its political unpopularity. Even if it were the greatest thing ever, you still wouldn't be able to convince people to like it, because it's just not culturally acceptable to us. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it's terribly built. So, again, it's kind of the same thing. It's like, I don't get it. We'd all be better off, even though we'd still disagree on a lot, if we just had a little bit of more of an objective view on things and wouldn't just follow people because they're saying what we find agreeable.
And I think that modern media and internet just makes it easier to only follow your group and to not put anyone else's message in. It's just easier.
It creates more competition and more groups, but I agree with you. It does that marginalization definitely.
If you want to close yourself off, it's pretty easy to do these days.
But I think it was easier back in the days when you had 6 channels on TV. If you just watched one, Fox News, that you're going to be living in a different world than everybody else.
It's possible.
So, I think that's a good place to close out. So,
thank you all for listening. Of course,
I'm Neurotoxin.
I am Joe Ryan. Thank you for listening to The Edge of Chaos. We can be found on the internet at edgeofchaospodcast.com. That's edgeofchaospodcast.com. Contact the show at edgeofchaospodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter at edgeofchaosshow. We can be found on Facebook at facebook.com/theedgeofchaos. Neurotoxins blog can be found at neurotoxins with an S, fyg.blogspot.com. My blog can be found at joeryansworld.blogspot.com. For Neurotoxin, this is Joe Ryan. Thank you for listening to The Edge of Chaos. Hello, Edge of Chaos listeners. Joe Ryan here. Today, instead of playing the usual comedy bumper after the show, I wanted to make a personal appeal about the upcoming MDA Muscle Walk, which is happening in San Diego Sunday, March 23rd, 2014, at Crown Point Park in Mission Bay. I've started a team and am participating in this event in honor of my friend Travis McKinney, who had Becker's muscular dystrophy and passed away at age 32. If you have a few minutes this holiday season, please check out my team page and make a donation, even a small one, to help people like my friend Travis. MDA provides much-needed research, treatments, therapies, medical equipment, assistance, and even a yearly summer camp. This is a disease that affects many children, but also families and friends, so please give what you can, even if it's only a small amount. Every little bit can make a big difference in someone's life. My team page can be found at http://www.mda.org/go/to/Team Travis. So basically www.mda.org/go/to/Team Travis. On behalf of my friend and his family, I thank you.